The day had begun like countless others in Afghanistan's sunlight, spilling harshly over barren hills, the air already thick with heat and dust. Specialist Elena Ramirez sat in the back of a Humvee, her rifle across her knees, scanning the desolate landscape through smudged ballistic glasses. The convoy was moving slowly, cautiously, along a dirt track skirting the edge of a small Afghan village. It was enemy country. Everyone knew it. The villagers had long since learned to hide their intentions behind blank stares. Children played in the distance. Women moved between clay-walled homes carrying water. But to the soldiers, every window and doorway seemed like the mouth of a rifle. Ramirez's unit had been sent on a routine reconnaissance patrol, if anything in Afghanistan could ever be called routine. Their orders were simple: survey, report, and keep moving. But years of war had taught the men and women in uniform that routine was often a trap waiting to spring. The first sign came subtly, too subtly for most to notice. A shepherd who had been walking his goats along the ridge suddenly turned away, hurrying them back toward the village. Then the children disappeared from the streets, scattering as if called home by unseen voices. Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. She'd seen this before. Something was coming. She reached forward and tapped the shoulder of the driver. "Something's off," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the rooftops. The driver didn't answer, but his grip tightened on the steering wheel. They both knew. Moments later, the world erupted. An ear-splitting boom tore through the air as the lead Humvee was lifted off the ground in a flash of fire and smoke. The shockwave slammed into Ramirez's vehicle, rattling metal and tossing her sideways. Her head struck the side of the doorframe, and for a moment, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, the inside of the Humvee was filled with smoke and screams. The driver was shouting into the radio, but static drowned his words. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops and alleys. Enemy fighters had been waiting, and the convoy had driven straight into their jaws. The training kicked in before thought could. Ramirez forced herself upright, her chest aching, ears ringing. She pushed open the door and dropped to the ground, landing hard on her side. Dirt stung her face. She raised her rifle and began returning fire, short, controlled bursts toward the shadows on the rooftops. Around her, chaos reigned. Soldiers scrambled for cover, some dragging the wounded behind burned-out vehicles. The smell of burning fuel and blood filled the air. The sound of men shouting mixed with the mechanical stutter of machine guns. Ramirez moved instinctively, hugging the side of a mud wall, scanning for targets. She saw one insurgent leaning out from a doorway, raising his AK. Her fingers squeezed the trigger, and he dropped before he could fire. Another shadow darted across the roofline, and she fired again, forcing him back. But then it happened. The second explosion was closer, the ground convulsing beneath her as another IED detonated. The force hurled Ramirez backward, her body slamming into the hard-packed earth. Pain exploded in her ribs, and she felt the sharp sting of shrapnel tearing into her side. Dust choked the air, blotting out the sun. She tried to rise, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her rifle slipped from her grasp, clattering beside her. She could hear her unit shouting, the heavy pounding of boots, the crunch of tires as surviving vehicles tried to maneuver. But they were moving forward, pressed by orders, adrenaline, and survival instinct. In the chaos, no one looked back. Ramirez lay there, half buried in dust, struggling to breathe. She could hear her radio crackle faintly, the distant voice of her commander calling out positions, the grim confirmation of casualties. She realized, with a cold clarity, that her name was being called. Her status was being logged. In the fog of war, she was already marked as gone. And then the enemy came. Through the haze, She saw shapes moving closer, insurgents advancing to finish what the IED had begun. She shut her eyes, willing herself to remain still, to look lifeless. Two men approached, rifles at the ready. They paused, glancing down at her. One nudged her with his boot, muttering in Pashto. Ramirez didn't move, didn't breathe. After a long moment, they turned and walked away, convinced she was nothing more than another broken body in the dirt. To them, the battle was still raging, and the living mattered more than the dead. As their footsteps faded, Ramirez opened her eyes. The world around her was chaos, gunfire in the distance, smoke rising from the burning wreckage, the cries of the wounded echoing through the village. But she was alone. Her unit was gone. She pressed her hand to her side and felt warm blood seeping through her uniform. Every breath was agony. She knew she didn't have long unless she moved. With a groan, she rolled onto her stomach and began to crawl, inch by inch, dragging herself toward the cover of a nearby ruined compound. The dirt scraped her face, rocks tearing her skin, but she didn't stop. Inside the crumbling walls, she collapsed, her vision swimming. The sounds of battle echoed faintly, growing more distant as her unit pushed deeper into the fight. Ramirez realized with a hollow ache that they believed she was dead. To them, she was already gone. And perhaps, in a way, she was. The Elena Ramirez who had entered the village that morning had been a soldier among many, disciplined, trained, part of a team. But the Elena, who now lay broken and bleeding in the shadows, was something else entirely. Alone, wounded, and written off by both friend and foe, she was no longer fighting for her country, her unit, or her orders. She was fighting for survival. In that moment, a transformation began. What the insurgents thought was a corpse was, in truth, the birth of a legend. The ghost of Elena Ramirez had risen, and soon those who believed her dead would learn just how wrong they were. Before Afghanistan, before the blast that tore her body open and changed the course of her life, Elena Ramirez had simply been Elena. To understand the soldiers sprawled in that Afghan dust, you had to look back at the girl who had learned far too early how to endure. Elena was born in a small town in southern Texas, the kind of place where the desert met the border, and survival meant working harder than you thought possible. Her parents, Manuel and Sofia Ramirez, had come to the United States with little more than determination and a willingness to take whatever jobs would keep food on the table. Manuel had worked construction by day and security by night, his hands always blistered, his back always sore. Sofia cleaned houses and raised their 3 children with a patience born of sacrifice. Life was not easy. The Ramirez family lived in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce, where most kids were claimed by gangs, dead-end jobs, or worse. Elena, the middle child, was quiet but watchful. She grew up listening more than speaking, learning how to read the room before she spoke. Her father used to joke that she was a silent one with eyes like a hawk. But Manuel Ramirez carried something else inside him, too a shadow that Elena came to recognize as the weight of war. He had been a young soldier in Vietnam, drafted before he was ready, and though he rarely spoke of what he had seen, his silence was louder than any story. Sometimes, late at night, Elena would hear him pacing the living room floor, muttering names she didn't recognize. When Elena turned 14, Manuel sat her down and told her something that stuck. "Life isn't about what you want, Mia," he said, his weathered face serious. "It's about what you can survive. You can lose everything else, but if you keep going, you win." That lesson carved itself deep into her. At school, Elena wasn't the star student, nor the athlete, nor the loud one with 1,000 friends. She was steady, dependable, the one who finished what she started. She worked odd jobs after class to help her mother bagging groceries, babysitting, scrubbing floors. While others dreamed about leaving town for college or city life, Elena never allowed herself fantasies. She thought in terms of responsibility, duty, survival. But after her father died suddenly of a heart attack when she was 17, Elena faced her first true crossroad. The house felt emptier without his presence, and with him gone, her mother carried the full weight of the family. Elena, who had quietly leaned on his wisdom, now felt the burden shift squarely onto her shoulders. Her older brother, Carlos, had already drifted into trouble, picking fights and running with the wrong crowd. Her younger sister, Isabella, was too young to understand what was happening. Elena realized then that if she didn't step up, the family might fracture completely. That was when she made the choice. She would enlist. The army recruiter spoke of opportunity, steady pay, travel, a future. But Elena wasn't thinking of adventure. She thought of her father's uniform folded neatly in an old trunk, the faded photographs of him standing tall in fatigues, the pride that had once lit his eyes. She thought of the mortgage payment her mother couldn't make alone. She thought of Carlos spiraling further into recklessness. The army wasn't just an option. It was a lifeline. Basic training at Fort Jackson nearly broke her. The physical punishment, the endless drills, the shouted orders, it was more than she had ever imagined. On her second week, when blisters covered her feet and her body ached from every muscle, she considered quitting. But her father's voice echoed in her head. It's about what you can survive. So she kept going. Her instructors soon noticed something unusual about her. She wasn't the strongest, wasn't the fastest, and she didn't crave attention like some of the others. But she never gave up. When others collapsed during runs, she kept pushing, teeth clenched, eyes forward. When others cursed under their breath, she stayed silent, conserving her energy. It was this quiet resilience that made her stand out. She didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't boast. She simply endured. One drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran of Iraq, pulled her aside after a grueling ruck march. "Specialist Ramirez," he said, squinting at her with something almost like respect. "You've got a kind of steel most people don't. Don't ever lose it. You'll need it out there." And he was right. By the time she deployed to Afghanistan, Elena had earned a reputation as reliable but unremarkable. She wasn't the soldier who drew attention, who barked the loudest or charged the fastest. She was the one who did her job with quiet precision, the one you could count on when things went bad. Among her unit, she was sometimes underestimated. She was one of the few women in her platoon, and though most treated her as an equal, a few dismissed her as the quiet one, assuming she lacked the aggression needed for combat. Elena didn't argue. She let them believe what they wanted. Words didn't matter to her, actions did. What her comrades didn't realize was that Elena carried something into the war that none of them had, the hard lessons of survival, from a life that had demanded endurance long before Afghanistan. She knew what it meant to go without food, to watch over a family with nothing in her own pockets, to push through when quitting wasn't an option. Her father's ghost walked with her too. Though he had never told her the details of his own battles in Vietnam, she imagined them often. The jungles, the nights filled with fear, the endless uncertainty of who was enemy and who was friend. In Afghanistan's deserts, Elena found herself treading a path eerily similar to the one he had walked decades before. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of failing, of not living up to the legacy he had left behind. In the weeks before the ambush, Elena had written letters home to her mother. She kept them simple, never mentioning the danger, only assuring her family that she was safe. "Tell Isa to keep up her studies," she wrote in one. "Tell Carlos I'm proud of him, even if he doesn't think I am. Tell them I'm doing my best, like Dad would want." It was a promise she carried in her chest every time she stepped into the armored Humvee. That morning, the morning of the blast, she remembered watching the desert horizon and thinking of her father. She had felt a strange sense of calm, as if he were walking beside her. She had no idea that within hours, she would be lying broken in the dirt, written off as another casualty. But the truth is, Elena Ramirez had been forged long before that moment. The woman the army thought of as ordinary, the woman her enemies believed they had killed, had been tempered by hardship, loss, and an iron will inherited from a father who knew the cost of war. And when the time came, that quiet strength would transform into something no one friend or foe could have predicted. She was not just another soldier. She was the ghost that war itself had created. The blast had felt like the earth itself had split beneath her. When Elena Ramirez came to, she was lying flat on her back, staring at a sky smeared with dust and smoke. The ringing in her ears drowned out the chaos around her shouts. Gunfire, the staccato rattle of rifles, echoing through the narrow streets. Her body felt heavy, unresponsive. She tried to move her legs, but pain shot up her side like fire. Shrapnel had torn through her vest and buried itself in her ribs. Her right arm was numb, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Warm blood seeped through her uniform, soaking into the Afghan dirt beneath her. Around her, the battle raged on. Her unit was still engaged shouts of, "Cover fire," and "Move, move, move," cut through the static haze of her hearing. Through the dust, she could see shadows of soldiers pushing forward, trying to regain momentum. The convoy had been split, and the surviving Humvees were repositioning. To them, the mission had to go on. And to them, she was already gone. Ramirez. She could faintly hear her name over the radio, then nothing. Her earpiece was damaged, the rest of the chatter lost to static. She wanted to answer, to say "I'm here," but her throat caught with blood and dust. Her mouth opened, but only silence came. She forced herself to roll to her side, every movement agony. Her rifle lay a few feet away, half buried in rubble. She clawed toward it, fingers slipping in dirt, nails breaking as she pulled herself inch by inch. When she finally wrapped her hand around the grip, the familiar weight grounded her. She wasn't dead. Not yet. But she would be if she didn't move. Her vision blurred as two shapes emerged from the smoke. Insurgents, rifles slung across their shoulders, moving cautiously through the carnage. They were checking bodies. Elena's heart thudded painfully against her broken ribs. She pressed her face into the dirt, forcing her chest to rise and fall as little as possible. She willed herself to stillness. Her body, covered in dust and blood, looked like any other lifeless form on the battlefield. The men drew closer. She could hear their voices, harsh and guttural, in a language she only half understood. One prodded a corpse with his boot, then nudged her leg. Pain ripped through her body, but she didn't flinch. The second man laughed a cruel, dismissive sound. He spat into the dirt beside her head and muttered something. Ramirez would later translate in her mind as another dead American dog. They moved on. Only when their footsteps faded did Ramirez dare to open her eyes again. Her chest heaved with the effort of holding in her breath, as she nearly passed out from the pain. But she was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. She dragged herself across the ground, inch by inch, toward the skeletal remains of a mud-walled compound nearby. Every pull of her arm sent fire through her body, but stopping meant death. If the insurgents circled back, if they searched more thoroughly, she wouldn't survive. She had to disappear. By the time she reached the compound's jagged doorway, her body was trembling violently. She collapsed just inside, pressing her back against the cool wall. The world outside thundered with gunfire, but inside, she was enveloped by a suffocating silence. Dust motes swirled in the air, the floor littered with broken pottery and scraps of old clothing. She pressed her hand against her side, feeling the slick warmth of blood. Her fingertips came away, red, sticky, glistening. Panic clawed at her chest. She needed a medic. She needed her unit. But no one was coming. She was alone. Her mind replayed the last few minutes in fragments. The blast, the shouting, the faces of her comrades as they charged forward without her. She couldn't blame them. In the chaos, they had to assume she was gone. To hesitate, to turn back, would have meant more lives lost. Still, the realization cut deeper than the shrapnel in her ribs. She was no longer part of the unit. She wasn't Specialist Ramirez, soldier of the U.S. Army. She was just another casualty. But she refused to accept that ending. She tore a strip from her undershirt, gritting her teeth as she pressed it against the wound. The pain nearly blinded her, but she forced herself to tie it tight, improvising a crude bandage. Her father's words echoed in her head. It's about what you can survive. The irony struck her then. Her father had survived Vietnam, only to die years later in his sleep. Now she was fighting a different war, carrying his lessons like armor. If she let herself die here, she would betray that legacy. Hours passed like days. Outside, the firefight moved farther away, the noise fading until only the distant rumble of explosions remained. At some point, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised shades of red and orange. Ramirez lay in the shadows of the ruined compound, body trembling, lips cracked with thirst. When night fell, the village grew quiet. Dogs barked in the distance. Occasionally, she heard footsteps, Taliban fighters patrolling, searching, or perhaps looting the dead. Each time she held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the corner, praying the darkness would conceal her. Her thoughts turned to her family. She imagined her mother at the kitchen table, sipping coffee in the quiet of dawn. She imagined Isabella doing her homework, her head bent low. And Carlos, she prayed, he hadn't given up on himself completely. Would they be told she was dead? Would her name be delivered to them on a folded piece of paper, like her father's medals had once been stored away in a box? The thought lit a fire inside her. No, not like this. When the patrols faded into silence, Ramirez forced herself to crawl deeper into the compound. She found an old jug in the corner, cracked, but still holding a few inches of stale water. She drank greedily, ignoring the taste of dirt and rot. Every drop felt like life itself. That night, she didn't sleep. She couldn't. The pain was constant, gnawing at her ribs, making her head swim. But more than the pain was the fear that if she closed her eyes, she wouldn't wake again. So she stayed awake, gripping her rifle, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. She wasn't dead. Not yet. And as long as she breathed, she wasn't just another casualty. She was something else now. Something the enemy hadn't expected. Something they would soon come to fear. The night after the ambush stretched into forever. Elena Ramirez sat in the corner of the ruined compound, her back pressed against the cold mud wall, her rifle balanced across her lap. Every breath was shallow, every movement agony. The shrapnel in her side felt like fire buried beneath her ribs, and each cough threatened to rip her apart from the inside. But she stayed awake. She had no choice. Sleep was dangerous. It might not let her wake again. The world outside shifted between silence and sudden bursts of sound. Sometimes she heard Taliban fighters laughing in the distance, their voices carried by the wind. Sometimes she caught the barking of dogs or the muted sobs of villagers caught between two wars. But mostly, there was quiet, the kind of suffocating quiet that pressed against her chest harder than any wound. Her body screamed for rest, for surrender. But she had been trained for moments like this, not for comfort, but for survival. She remembered her drill sergeant's voice in basic training. Pain is weakness leaving the body. You control the pain, or it controls you. Back then, it had felt like a cruel slogan shouted at exhausted recruits. Now, alone in enemy territory, it became a lifeline. She forced herself to move. Slowly, carefully, she unwrapped her improvised bandage. The wound was ugly raw flesh torn open, edges darkened by dirt and dried blood. Infection was already a threat. She tore another strip from her undershirt, gritting her teeth as she cleaned it as best she could with the last drops of her canteen. The sting nearly knocked her unconscious, but she held on, tying the fabric tight again. Then she did something that surprised even her. She began to pray. Not out loud, not the kind of prayer her mother would whisper over candles in church, but quietly, inside herself. It wasn't for deliverance or miracles. It was for strength, for the will to keep crawling forward when every instinct told her to stop, for her father's voice to stay with her a little longer. The days that followed blurred together into a brutal rhythm of survival. She learned to move only at night, when shadows concealed her. She crawled from one abandoned home to another, searching for scraps half-rotten bread, a discarded water jug, anything to keep her alive. She scavenged bandages from deserted aid kits, stripped bullets from the pouches of fallen fighters, pieced together what she could. Her rifle became an extension of her body, never leaving her side. Every action was deliberate. Every sound, every breath, measured. She became silent, not only out of necessity, but out of instinct. The first time she saw them again, the fighters who had left her for dead, she froze in the ruins of a collapsed wall. A patrol passed within 20 feet of her hiding place. She could smell their sweat, hear the scrape of their boots on the dirt. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she did not fire. She wasn't ready yet. She was too weak, too broken. To fire now would mean death. So she waited. Patience became her ally. Each night, she studied their routines. She counted how many men patrolled, how often they stopped, which houses they used as strongholds. She memorized the sound of their voices, the rhythm of their footsteps. To them, the battlefield was theirs, already won. To her, it was a map slowly etching itself into her memory. Her body, though battered, began to adapt. She grew leaner, harder, her senses sharper. Hunger sharpened her focus rather than dulled it. Pain became background noise. She no longer thought in hours or days. She thought in breaths, in heartbeats, in chances. And with each passing night, she began to feel something shift inside her. She was no longer Specialist Ramirez, the quiet soldier in a convoy. That identity had died in the blast. What rose in its place was something else, something forged by isolation, fear, and the raw will to endure. The villagers began to notice her before the fighters did. Once, a young boy spotted her in the shadows, crouched near a broken water pump. He stared at her for a long moment, eyes wide with fear and awe, before running back to his family. Ramirez didn't chase him. She didn't speak, but she knew the whispers would spread. And they did. Whispers of the American woman who had died, yet whose shadow moved through the village at night. Whispers of a figure who left footprints but never spoke, who drank from wells and disappeared before dawn. To the superstitious, it was a ghost. To the Taliban, it was impossible. Ramirez fueled those whispers. She didn't reveal herself. She didn't speak to anyone. She was a shadow. She let the fear grow on its own, feeding it with silence. But silence was not enough. One night, after nearly 2 weeks alone, Ramirez's moment came. She had been watching a small Taliban squad, 4 men moving lazily through the village, confident in their control. They stopped near a burned-out vehicle, laughing, tossing stones. They had grown careless. Her hands were steady as she raised her rifle. The first shot cracked through the night, and one man dropped instantly. The others spun, shouting, firing blindly into the dark. Ramirez shifted, silent as smoke, and fired again. Another fell. The last two scrambled for cover, panic replacing their laughter. By the time they realized where the shots were coming from, she had already melted back into the shadows. Only 2 bodies were left behind. 2 was enough. By morning, the story spread like wildfire. The fighters muttered to each other, uneasy. The dead woman, the American they thought killed in the blast, was hunting them. For Ramirez, it was more than survival now. It was war on her own terms. The silent recovery was no longer just about healing her wounds. It was about becoming something else, entirely a presence that the enemy couldn't comprehend. She was weak, scarred, and outnumbered. But in their fear, she found her strength. And in that strength, she began her transformation from forgotten casualty to the ghost they would never forget. The night air in the village was heavy with dust, smoke, and silence. Ramirez crouched in the corner of the ruined compound, her cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle, her eyes fixed on the figures moving below. She had been watching them. For 3 nights now, memorizing their movements, studying their habits, waiting for the exact moment when carelessness would hand her the advantage. Tonight was that night. Her heart did not pound. Her nerves did not shake. In the stillness, she felt like part of the earth itself, stone, dust, shadow. The 3 men moved slowly along the street, their rifles slung lazily, one of them laughing as he kicked an empty can down the road. They thought this land was theirs, that they had crushed everything that stood in their way. They believed she was just another casualty, another corpse left in the dust. They didn't know she had been watching, waiting, changing. She took in a long breath, then let it go. The first shot cracked the silence, sharp and sudden, and the man in front dropped where he stood. His companions froze for a half-second too long, confusion flashing across their faces before panic took hold. They began to shout, firing wildly. Into the dark, bullets sparking off stone walls and ricocheting into the night. Ramirez was already moving, sliding through the shadows like water, shifting position as if the night itself carried her. She steadied her rifle again, squeezed the trigger, and another man pitched forward, clutching his chest. The last one broke, stumbling into an alley, screaming for help as if the darkness itself was alive and chasing him. By the time reinforcements arrived, rushing into the street with flashlights and curses, Ramirez was gone. All that remained were the bodies cooling in the dust and the echo of gunfire fading into silence. She had taken her first strike, and it was more than just vengeance. It was a message. She retreated into the ruins, careful not to leave a trail. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. She had not fired out of rage, but out of precision. Rage wasted bullets. Precision planted fear, and fear was the weapon she would need most. They would not know where she was, or when she would strike again. All they would know was that a dead woman had risen to hunt them. Ramirez found her hiding place, a hollowed-out cellar beneath a collapsed house. She laid her rifle across her. Knees, her body still tense, her mind alive with the memory of each shot. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stir in her chest that wasn't despair or hunger. It was control. For days she had been crawling through the dirt, surviving on scraps, moving like an animal in the dark. Now she was something else. She had taken back the battlefield. The whispers began the next morning. She heard them drifting through the alleyways when she crept to the edge of the village for water. Locals spoke in hushed tones of an American woman who had been seen in the shadows, of fighters who had been cut down by a ghost. Some said she had died weeks ago, her soul now bound to vengeance. Others swore they had seen her face in the dark, pale and bloodied, watching them before vanishing. Ramirez said nothing. She let the whispers grow. A shadow did not need to speak. A shadow only needed to move. Her second strike came days later. She had been tracking a small outpost where fighters stored crates of ammunition and supplies. For 3 nights she studied them, 3 guards posted at dusk, usually careless, one always asleep by midnight. She waited until the village lay silent under the weight of the stars, then crept through the ruins, her knife gripped tight in her hand. The first man never saw her coming. She slid the blade across his throat and pulled him into the dark before his body hit the ground. The second stirred at the sound, his rifle half lifting, but her shot split the silence, and he crumpled. The last bolted for the door, shouting in panic, only to be cut down before he crossed the threshold. Ramirez dragged their bodies into the shadows, then set the charge she had stolen from another wrecked cache. She retreated to the ridge above, lying flat in the dirt, her chest heaving as she waited. Minutes later, the night erupted in fire and thunder. Flames clawed into the sky as the ammunition clipped off, sending tracer rounds screaming through the air. The explosion lit the valley as if a second sun had risen, and the sound rolled for miles. She watched it burn until the roof collapsed, then slipped away before the fighters could swarm the wreckage. By dawn, the outpost was nothing but rubble. By noon, the whispers were louder. They said the ghost had destroyed it, that she had slipped past guards and guardsmen alike, that she could not be killed because she was already dead. Ramirez did not believe in ghosts. She believed in training, in patience, in the mind's ability to twist fear into a weapon sharper than any blade. But if her enemies wanted to believe she was something otherworldly, she would let them. Fear was as useful as bullets, and unlike bullets, it never ran out. Her campaign grew slowly, carefully. She never struck the same place twice, never left a trail, never stayed where she had killed. She became a phantom, a shadow moving from ruin to ruin. Sometimes she left signs on purpose, an empty casing in the middle of a road, a helmet hanging from a tree, a bloody handprint on a wall. Small, deliberate marks to remind them she was watching, to remind them she was coming. She knew she couldn't win a war alone, but she didn't need to. All she needed was to break their certainty, to turn their confidence into fear. Each time she struck, she could see the shift in them. They no longer patrolled with laughter in their voices. Their eyes darted nervously into the shadows. Their rifles shook in their hands. Men who once strutted through the village now moved in silence, their fear louder than any shout. One night, she made a mistake. Crawling along the ridge above, a convoy, she shifted her weight onto loose stone, and it clattered down the slope. Flashlights stabbed into the darkness. Voices shouted. Rifles cracked. She ran through the dust, bullets tearing into the earth at her feet. An RPG slammed into the ridge behind her, the shockwave throwing her to the ground. Dirt filled her mouth, her lungs, her eyes. She staggered to her feet, sprinting into the night, every nerve on fire. For hours they hunted her, their shots chasing her through the ruins. Only when the night grew silent again did she collapse into a drainage ditch, her chest heaving, her body trembling. She lay there, filthy and bleeding, but alive. Almost. They had almost caught her. Almost killed the ghost. Almost proved she was human after all. But almost wasn't enough. When she rose again, she was harder than before. Fear had brushed against her, but she had not surrendered to it. She carried it, sharpened it, and turned it outward. The next night, she struck again, not for food, not for shelter, but to remind them that she was still out there, still watching. The men who had left her for dead were learning the truth. She was not a casualty. She was not gone. She was the shadow in their minds, the whisper in their ears, the figure in the dark that would not go away. Her first strike had been a message. Every strike after was a promise. And by then, The phantom soldier was no longer just a whisper. She was a legend. The village no longer belonged to them. It no longer belonged to anyone. At night, the alleyways whispered, the wind carrying rumors of a woman who should not be alive. Men who once walked with arrogance now moved with their rifles pressed tight to their chests, their eyes darting into every shadow. The once careless laughter was gone, replaced by silence so heavy it seemed to suffocate the streets. They believed in her now. They believed in the ghost. Ramirez had become more than a survivor. She was a hunter. The first strike had lit the fire, but now the blaze spread, and she was feeding it, molding it, shaping it into a war of her own making. She knew she could not defeat them with bullets. Alone her ammunition was still precious. Every round counted and accounted for. But fear multiplied itself. Fear did the work for her. Each day she lay low, conserving her strength, her body still weakened by wounds that never had the chance to heal properly. At night she emerged, crawling through ruins, slipping into alleyways, moving like the very spirit they believed her to be. She left no pattern, no rhythm, nothing they could predict. One night it was a sniper's shot cracking across the rooftops, a fighter dropping dead before his comrades even realized the danger. Another night it was a knife flashing in the dark, a guard dragged silently into an abandoned courtyard, his body left posed in the moonlight for the others to find. Sometimes she did not kill at all. She only let them know she was there. A rifle casing placed on a doorstep. A boot print on the edge of a rooftop. A single whispered breath through a stolen radio. I am not gone. The effect was immediate, almost intoxicating. Entire squads began to desert, slipping away into the desert night rather than face her. Outposts that once hummed with activity stood abandoned, supplies left behind in haste. The fighters who stayed grew reckless, paranoid, their nerves snapping at every sound. They fired into shadows, cursed at the wind, struck villagers for imagined betrayals. Their control was slipping, and in their fear, Ramirez found her strength. But fear could only carry her so far. She knew this. Each time she struck, she risked exposure. Each time she moved, the line between hunter and hunted blurred. One mistake, one misstep, and they would have her. One night she nearly paid for it. She had been trailing a squad that moved cautiously through the outer streets, 6 men armed with rifles and flashlights. She followed from the rooftops, her body low, her breath shallow, her rifle cradled against her chest. When one of them lagged behind, she dropped silently into the alley, closing the distance in seconds. Her knife flashed once, quick and clean, and he sagged into her arms without a sound. But as she dragged him into the shadows, a beam of light swept over her. Shouts rang out. Bullets tore through the air, plaster and stone erupting around her. She sprinted into the ruins, weaving through alleyways, her heart hammering. They chased her, their gunfire wild and frantic, their voices cracking with fury. She ducked into a collapsed cellar, her back pressed against the damp wall as dust rained from above. The footsteps thundered past, boots pounding like drums of war, but they did not find her. She held her breath until her chest ached, until silence returned. When she finally slipped back into the night, her hands were trembling, her body drenched in sweat. She had almost died again, but almost was not enough. She survived. She always survived. The close call did not weaken her resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. They were terrified of her, but she had seen their desperation. They would not stop hunting. They could not stop. To let her love was to admit defeat, and men like them would rather choke on their own fear than accept humiliation. So she pushed harder. She turned their desperation against them. She began setting traps small, simple, effective. Loose wires strung across doorways, broken glass placed under windows where they might climb. She even lured them once into a dead-end alley, her footsteps deliberately loud, her shadow deliberately cast. When they followed, crowding into the choke point, she tossed a stolen grenade behind them and vanished as the blast tore the air apart. The survivors spoke of her in terror, their words trembling, their voices hollow. She was everywhere, they said. She was nowhere. She was not human, not anymore. And slowly, painfully, Ramirez began to believe a part of it herself. Not that she was a ghost, but that the woman she had been, the soldier with a call sign, the daughter of a proud father, the quiet girl from Texas, was gone. In her place was something else, something born of fire, blood, and silence. The villagers no longer looked at her with pity or sorrow when they caught glimpses of her in the dark. They bowed their heads, whispered prayers, left scraps of bread or water where she might find them. To them, too, she was no longer a soldier. She was a spirit of vengeance, a guardian, a curse upon those who had brought war to their homes. There was a moment, one rare moment of stillness, when she questioned it all. She sat in the ruins of a mosque, the moonlight spilling through a shattered dome, her rifle across her knees. Her hands were steady, her eyes alert, but inside her chest, doubt coiled like smoke. Was she still alive? Truly alive? Or had she become nothing more than the story they told? A shadow clinging to the battlefield, doomed never to leave it? The thought did not last. A noise outside shattered the quiet of patrol. Careless again, too sure of themselves in the place they thought abandoned. She rose like a phantom from the darkness, her rifle already raised. 3 shots rang out, 3 bodies fell. The doubt faded, and the ghost walked again. By the end of that month, the Taliban's grip on the area had fractured. They no longer controlled the night. They no longer trusted the villages. They no longer believed the battlefield was theirs. Every loss, every failure, every body left in the dirt was a reminder of her. They whispered her name like a curse, and in their silence, she thrived. The ghost's war was not about victory in the traditional sense. Ramirez knew she could not liberate the valley alone, could not drive them out entirely. But she did not need to. What she gave them was worse than defeat. She gave them fear, shame, uncertainty. She took from them the one thing they believed unbreakable, their dominance. And as she crouched in the ruins one more night, the cold rifle steady in her hands, she understood that this was only the beginning. They had left her for dead. They had buried her in their minds. But the dead did not fight back. And Ramirez was still fighting. She would fight until the legend consumed them whole. The morning sun crept over the jagged mountains, painting the valley in a haze of gold and dust. From her hiding place inside a shattered home, Ramirez watched the horizon, her eyes narrowing as the distant hum of engines grew louder. At first, she thought it was another Taliban convoy, and her body tensed, her rifle rising into position. But as the vehicles came into view, bouncing across the broken terrain in staggered formation, her breath caught in her throat. These were not the battered trucks of insurgents. These were armored Humvees, their silhouettes unmistakable, their flags snapping in the wind. For weeks, she had dreamed of this moment, imagined it in flashes as she drifted into restless sleep. American vehicles rolling into the valley, the voices of her comrades, the chance to step out of the shadows, to be Elena Ramirez again, not the ghost they feared. And yet, now that it was happening, she did not move. She stayed crouched in the ruins, her finger curled against the trigger, her chest tight with hesitation. She had been gone too long. She had been someone else too long. Would they even believe she was alive? Would they even recognize her? The Humvees pushed deeper into the village, their mounted guns scanning rooftops, soldiers spilling out with rifles raised. The locals gathered cautiously, pointing toward alleys, whispering in rapid Pashto. Ramirez crept closer, her body low, slipping through the shadows until she was near enough to hear them. The voices of her brothers in arms drifted through the morning air, rough, steady, filled with the familiar cadence of soldiers who had carried the weight of war too long. Her throat tightened. She wanted to call out, to shout her name, to step into the open and feel the relief wash over her. But fear anchored her feet. What if they didn't believe it was her? What if they saw only a ragged figure, gaunt and scarred, with wild eyes and a rifle clutched too tightly in trembling hands? So she stayed hidden, watching, waiting, just as she had done for weeks. The Taliban struck before she could decide. It began with a shot, a single crack echoing through the air, a soldier dropping to his knees. Then the valley erupted. Gunfire roared from the hillsides, bullets tearing through walls and dirt, grenades arcing into the streets. The Americans dove for cover, shouting commands, returning fire in precise bursts. Ramirez's instincts took over. She swung her rifle into place and fired from the shadows, her shots slicing into the ambushers. One fighter toppled backward. Another spun and fell, clutching his chest. The battle was chaos, dust, and blood and thunder. Ramirez moved like she had so many nights before, slipping from cover to cover, her rifle steady, her aim merciless. She picked targets carefully, cutting down the ones who threatened her comrades most, her shots coming from angles that confused the enemy. To the Americans, it must have felt like a phantom was fighting alongside them, unseen, relentless. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, until at last the gunfire thinned, then sputtered, then died altogether. The Taliban broke, fleeing back into the hills, their shouts fading on the wind. Silence returned, heavy and fragile. The Americans regrouped in the street, dragging the wounded into cover, checking their weapons. And then, finally, one of them noticed. "Who the hell's out there?" A voice called, rough and sharp, cutting through the quiet. Ramirez froze. She could see him, a Marine sergeant, his rifle raised, scanning the ruins. Others turned with him, their weapons trained on the shadows where she crouched. For a heartbeat, she almost slipped away again, almost vanished back into the dark. That was where she belonged now, wasn't it? A ghost had no place in the daylight. But something inside her shifted. She lowered her rifle slowly, stepped into the open, her movements deliberate, her body trembling. Sunlight struck her face for the first time in weeks, and she saw the soldier's eyes widen. "My God!" One whispered. "Jesus Christ!" another muttered. They stared at her as though she had risen from the grave. And in a way, she had. Her lips parted, her voice hoarse and broken from weeks of silence. "Specialist Elena Ramirez. United States Army." The words scraped out of her throat like rusted steel. For a moment, no one moved. The sergeant's eyes searched her face, disbelief battling recognition. Then his rifle lowered, his jaw tightening. "Ramirez? That's impossible. You're. We thought you were KIA." "I was," she said simply. The silence stretched, thick with shock. Then one of the younger soldiers muttered, almost to himself, "The ghost." It was her. The sergeant stepped forward cautiously, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. He took in her hollow cheeks, her blood-stained clothes, the scars carved across her skin. She was barely more than a shadow of the woman they had known, but her eyes, those fierce, steady eyes, had not changed. "You've been out here all this time?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. "They left me for dead. I didn't die." Her voice cracked, but her stare held steady. "I made them pay." The soldiers exchanged glances, disbelief giving way to something else, respect, awe, even fear. They had heard the rumors, the stories whispered by villagers and fighters alike. The ghost that haunted the valley, the phantom that struck in the night. Now, standing before them, flesh and blood, was the truth behind the legend. They gathered around her slowly, carefully, as though approaching a wounded animal that might lash out. One soldier reached into his pack, pulling free a canteen, offering it with trembling hands. She took it, the water burning down her throat, tears stinging her eyes at the simple taste of it. Another soldier draped a blanket over her shoulders, though the sun was already hot on her skin. In that moment, surrounded by her comrades, Ramirez felt the weight of the weeks crash down on her. The hunger, the wounds, the nights alone in the dark, it all pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. For the first time since the blast, she allowed herself to cry. They didn't call her by her name at first. They didn't need to. To them, she was the ghost come alive, the legend walking in daylight. But as the Humvees rolled out of the village hours later, carrying her with them, she heard it soft, steady, reverent. "Welcome home, Ramirez." She closed her eyes, leaning back against the seat, her rifle still cradled in her arms. Home was far away. The war was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she was no longer alone. And the ghost, at least for now, could rest. The helicopter blades cut through the hot Afghan air, their roar shaking the dust loose from the mountainsides as the medevac lifted specialist Elena Ramirez away from the valley that had almost become her grave. Her body felt heavy, every muscle screaming from exhaustion, but her mind was sharp, locked on the faces of the soldiers around her. They watched her with something she had never seen before, not just relief, not just admiration, but a kind of reverence. To them, she was more than a soldier. She was a legend who had stepped out of myth and into flesh and blood. As the helicopter banked toward the forward operating base, Ramirez kept her eyes fixed on the land below. The villages and ridges slid past like ghosts of the weeks she had endured alone. Each hill, each alley, each ruined wall carried memories. The men she had hunted, the nights she had stalked the shadows, the silence that had threatened to consume her. Part of her wondered if leaving meant abandoning the ghost she had become. Could she ever go back to simply being Elena Ramirez, Army specialist? When the helicopter landed, the base erupted in disbelief. Soldiers came out in droves, their faces twisting from confusion to shock to awe. Everyone had heard whispers, the impossible stories carried by locals about a phantom woman haunting Taliban patrols. Some thought it was propaganda, others a cruel rumor. And yet here she was, stepping down from the bird, gaunt and scarred, but standing on her own 2 feet. Medical officers rushed forward, insisting on stretchers and IVs, but Ramirez brushed them off, refusing to be carried. She wanted to walk, even if every step felt like her body was splintering. She needed them to see her strength. Needed them to see that she had not been broken. Inside the field hospital, her wounds were treated, her body cleaned, her weight noted with alarm. She had lost nearly 30 pounds, her muscles wasted from hunger, her skin marked with burns and cuts. Still, as the doctors murmured in disbelief, she caught the reflection of her eyes in a stainless steel tray. They were the same eyes that had stared down enemies in the dark, that had haunted the insurgents until they whispered about her like children fearing monsters under the bed. She did not look like the soldier who had left Texas months ago. She looked like something else entirely. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Officers came to see her, some shaking their heads, others trying to piece together how she had survived. "You should be dead," one colonel said bluntly, staring at her chart. "I should be," Ramirez replied, her voice steady. "But I wasn't." When intelligence officers debriefed her, they listened with wide eyes as she described weeks of movements, ambushes, caches destroyed. Every detail matched reports they had received from the field insurgents disappearing, attacks collapsing, whispers of the ghost that stalked them. The realization hit them. The legend that had unnerved enemy fighters and bolstered American morale wasn't a rumor. It was her. By the time she was flown back to the United States, the story had already spread. Soldiers at forward bases repeated it around mess tables, embellishing details until Ramirez became something more than human in their retelling. They said she vanished into smoke when shot at, that she slit throats with silent precision, that she walked through minefields untouched. The truth was raw and human, but in the retelling, it grew into something unshakable. Back home, her return was not marked by parades or headlines. Much of what had happened remained classified, locked in reports that would never see daylight. To the public, she was just another soldier who had endured hardship and made it back. But within the military community, her name carried a different weight. When young recruits whispered about heroes, when seasoned operators spoke about survival against all odds, her story always surfaced. Some called her the Ghost of Sanger Valley. Others simply called her Phantom 7, a code name that emerged from the idea that she was more spirit than soldier. Ramirez herself rejected the myth. She didn't want to be remembered as a shadow. She wanted to be remembered as a woman who had fought, who had endured, who had survived. But legends have a way of slipping beyond the control of those who live them. Late at night, in the quiet of her recovery room, she often wrestled with the weight of it all. She remembered every face, every man she had taken down in the dark. She remembered the fear in their eyes before the final shot. Survival had demanded it, but the memory clung to her like smoke. Sometimes she asked herself if she was really alive, or if some part of her had died in that first blast, leaving only the ghost behind. Yet when her fellow soldiers came to visit, when they stood at her bedside and clasped her hand with tears in their eyes, she understood what her survival meant. To them, she wasn't just Ramirez. She was proof that the human spirit could walk through hell and come back standing. She was living evidence that even in the darkest valleys, hope could survive. Months later, when she was invited to speak to a graduating class of soldiers at Fort Benning, she stood on the stage, her uniform crisp, her body still bearing scars. The auditorium went silent as she approached the podium. She looked out at the faces young men and women about to step into a world that would test them beyond measure. "I'm not a ghost," she began, her voice firm but calm. "I'm a soldier, just like you. I bled, I feared. I broke, but I didn't stop. And that's what makes the difference. Not legends, not myths, just the refusal to quit." Her words hung in the air, heavy and real. The silence broke into thunderous applause, not because she was a phantom, but because she was a survivor. In time, Ramirez returned to her family in Texas. Her mother wept when she saw her, clutching her daughter as though she might vanish again. Her community welcomed her back quietly, without the noise of cameras or headlines. She found peace in small things, sunsets over wide fields, the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of children playing on the street. Yet even in that peace, the shadow of who she had been lingered. Whispers of her story still traveled. Veterans repeated it over beers in dim bars, their voices lowering when they spoke of the ghost who had hunted insurgents in the night. Young recruits swapped her name in training camps, daring each other to see if they could ever match what she had done. She never asked for the legend, but she understood now it wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to every soldier who needed to believe survival was possible, even when everything screamed otherwise. Specialist Elena Ramirez, the woman once thought lost to an IED, became something more than herself. In the eyes of the enemy, she had been a ghost. In the eyes of her brothers and sisters in arms, she was proof that death could be defied. And though she lived quietly, her legacy marched on in every soldier who whispered her name before stepping into battle. The ghost was no longer hunting. But the memory of her would haunt the enemy, inspire the living, and echo through the history of soldiers who fought in the shadows.